Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. It's very cool. I think this is my first cybersecurity API related conference in general. So excited to be a part of it. As Dan said, my name is Bill Doerrfeld. I'm not an engineer or a developer, really. I could probably be dangerous with some code, but I'm more on the writing side of things, more on like the analyst side of things. I'm a tech journalist and editor. I have been submitting to a handful of publications throughout the years, but most of my work is centered with Nordic APIs. I'm the editor in chief of this blog and this conference community. It is based in Sweden. That's where some of my other teammates are. And then I oversee a small team of writers that are internationally based. And we run a couple of conferences. As Dan mentioned, we run the Platform Summit in Stockholm every year, and then the Austin API Summit in Austin, Texas. Outside of Nordic APIs, I freelance for a handful of publications. Like I write for CIO.com somewhat frequently lately. Lead Dev, Security Boulevard, DevOps.com, and some other presences. But yeah, I love writing, interviewing experts, kind of following new trends and reviewing new reports that are being released in the industry. My big beat has been the API economy for almost 10 years now. I kind of sort of got into this with programmable web. If some of the people here might know about that defunct directory that was cataloging all the APIs out there. So that was like my first introduction into this world, just going and researching APIs and adding them to this manually curated directory, which is no longer available. But I think we got up to about 30,000 APIs that Presence was tracking. So it was a lot, really interesting work to follow that over the years. Yeah, I have hobbies, but that's personal, you know? So to avoid data overexposure and to follow the principle of least privilege, I'm just going to redact that information. Seems fitting for a cybersecurity conference, I think. If you like this stuff, you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn at Doerrfeld Bill, or check out my portfolio website at doerrfeld.io. Or yeah, definitely visit the Nordic API's presence for a lot of good API topics on design, security, what it means to be an API platform, and more. So, long intro out of the way. Usually I don't do this kind of intro slide about myself. It feels weird, but for some reason I felt compelled to today. All right, on to the presentation. This might be what you think your API portfolio looks like. A nice modern city at the turn of the century. It might not be as futuristic as you'd want, but hey, your RESTful APIs get the job done. You might even say your integrations are beautiful. Your connections, like these paved roads here, are all functional and can withstand the traffic you impose on them. Your microservices, like these buildings, might do unique things, but are each up to code and standardized. And for the most part, they all use similar design styles that have been approved by some sort of governing board. All in all, things are well maintained and clean. Your APIs, like the blueprints for these buildings, are documented and cataloged somewhere. And people oversee your beautiful API city and ensure that everyone else has the resources that they need. Everything works and everyone is happy in your backend utopia. Well, if you're in a large organization and think your API portfolio meets all those criteria, you are probably living in a dream world. Welcome to the desert of the real. This is the unknown reality of many enterprise software backends. It's a place populated with things like zombie APIs and shadow endpoints. Hackers often exploit methods with broken authentication and poor authorization. API keys are routinely leaked, and the technical debt everywhere is surmounting day after day. There's spaghetti code everywhere, broken integrations, and broken clients abound. Nothing is really consistent, and there's a lack of code reusability, unfortunately. Nothing is documented, and there's hundreds of ad hoc design styles everywhere. And due to this relative inconsistency, the developer experience is unfortunately not that great. Employee satisfaction is low, and due to employee churn, most of the folks who actually built this stuff are long gone by now. So supporting all this becomes pretty tedious. It sounds pretty grim, right? Well, if you're experiencing any of this, I'd argue that you have API sprawl. There it is in big bold letters. Yikes. So we're gonna look into this desert of the real and pull back the dream world a bit in this presentation. So today I want to briefly look into API sprawl. We'll take the red pill and look into what's behind this dream world, like I alluded to earlier, and we'll look into the state of API adoption at large. I kind of want to define what we mean by sprawl and what we mean by API sprawl in general, or how I define it at least, and hopefully leave you with some tips and tricks to avoid this sort of technical debt and the downsides that might come with it. A lot of the information in this presentation is tied to a blog post that I wrote for the API Futures Initiative. This was a part of a cool project spearheaded by Matthew Reinbold at the start of this year, which collected a lot of people's thoughts on what is the most pressing concern for APIs in 2024. So a lot of API thought leaders, if you will, contributed their thoughts to this question. And my answer was API sprawl. So if you like this stuff, you can read that article, API Futures, API Sprawl to be a pressing concern in 2024. So let's look at the state of API adoption in general. First off, it's kind of hard to quantify how many APIs are out there because it's sort of like the Matrix, it's all around us. To continue that theme, if you didn't catch it yet. On the consumer side of things, they're pretty ingrained into our daily lives. Weather applications, logins, payment processing, travel booking, fintech and open banking, geolocation. A lot of what we use as everyday consumers has an API on the back end that it's tied to. And the same goes for developers and the more B2B side of things. If we're talking about internal connections or integrations, wrappers over internal databases, DevOps tooling, CRM systems, cloud-based collaboration, fintech, like I said, all the banking stuff. E-commerce is also another example. So APIs are pretty pervasive. Some might even say they are ubiquitous. One F5 report from, I think it was, 2021, estimated that the total number of APIs worldwide is approaching 200 million. And this is good to note. It's not just what we think of as public APIs, because a lot of the time you think of APIs, at least we do, talking about this stuff and consider like the Stripe or the Twilios of the world. Well, no, the majority of these are internal, I'd say, API first, microservices architectures are behind this, or just some sort of wrapper over some internal database. So internal services are a big portion of this kind of huge number that we're seeing out there. Partner ecosystems are a part of that as well. APIs are helping to connect partners to exchange data and enable new functionality between them. And then, a smaller subset are definitely like the API as a product or open APIs that are sharing information to the public. Some of these public APIs might be monetizing them as well. And we also see APIs coming out as offshoots of existing platforms that are out there in order to like supplement these platforms with additional functionality and different ways to integrate with them or use them. So there are many types of APIs out there catering to many different stakeholders, and often we see this variety existing within a single organization. Just to kind of double click on the whole internal API concept, one report from Rapid in 2022 found that companies with 10,000 or more employees tend to have over 250 internal APIs. So this goes to show that how many services are being developed internally. Another report from the same year found that the average org has over 15,000 APIs in use, and they estimated a growth rate of over 200% within just 1 year of time. So these figures are only describing APIs that companies actually know about. So this data could actually be skewed in terms of like unknown shadow services. But yeah, I think it's just a good thing to note how many services are actually in there. And awareness is lacking, arguably. There's this one report from EMA that found only 10% of organizations fully document their APIs. And 70% of organizations had 30% or more APIs undocumented. I found the same study. So there's probably plenty more behind the scenes that are just people don't know about. They're going unknown. So awareness is lagging, and I think that's contributing to sprawl. Additionally, we're seeing new security risks emerging across the board. One is improper inventory management, which kind of directly talks to what I'm alluding to with the lack of proper documentation of these services. Another is unsafe consumption of APIs. So companies tend to be ingesting third-party services in addition to building them as well, building APIs as well, I should say. And they're not always applying the correct input validation on these third-party API services. So that was included in the recent OWASP API Security Top 10 for 2023. Another one I found interesting was unrestricted access to sensitive business flows. This one's peculiar because it's not exactly a specific vulnerability that hackers might be exploiting. They're exploiting the business logic and using it to their advantage to do things like price gouging or affecting the application for other nefarious means. So new security risks are emerging. Still, things like broken access control and bad authorization for APIs still remain at the number one of these lists in terms of top risks out there. But it's just interesting to see new risks emerge that I think point to API sprawl conditions. And I'm a little worried about this because more growth is anticipated for the API economy at large. There was a survey conducted from Nihilus last year that found 86% of developers anticipate their use of APIs to increase. So everything I mentioned in these previous slides is just anticipated to get bigger, potentially worse from the security side of things. And I think the recent AI revolution is going to mean that more APIs are produced and consumed in parallel with this growth of AI, whether it be for integrating public LLMs or using generative AI tools, like integrating that into new applications that are being developed, as well as AI development in terms of using APIs to fetch data for real-time information or retraining models and other use cases. So yeah, I see the rise of AI and APIs going hand in hand. But still, I haven't really answered what exactly is sprawl, right? Well, one consulting agency defines sprawl as the uncontrolled expansion of various technologies, be it software, hardware, or cloud services within an organization. I think tech sprawl is kind of like technical debt. We all have it. We can't really avoid it to some degree. But the scary aspect of this is the whole uncontrolled element. Because when you have uncontrolled tech just emerging, it can potentially become unknown, and a lack of standards or awareness could, I think, degrade security and hurt the security posture of the organization. So, but going a little deeper, what exactly is API sprawl? Well, I define API sprawl as quick haphazard adoption of APIs without following best practices, to put it shortly. I think a lot of people working with APIs, maybe their organization thought the API movement was just a passing fad in the past, and probably didn't plan for the long term or invest in things like style guides or API governance procedures. And now they're starting to see the effects. Leadership is finally kind of starting to realize, hey, maybe we need to govern all these integrations and ad hoc services that aren't really standardized internally. Oops. It can be challenging for companies that don't have like internal guidelines or a good documentation regimen for these services. You might be overwhelmed with the escalating number of endpoints, Juggling diverse versions and support timelines simultaneously can be tricky as well. Most people are doing their best, of course, but with a widening API portfolio, I think it's starting to become a little challenging in these large organizations, and we're starting to see like tooling and governance approaches emerge to rectify that. Also, just the sheer fact that there are so many disparate API styles out there now. Many organizations are still supporting SOAP XML-based APIs that emerged in like the software-oriented architecture days. Of course, we have REST, even though many web APIs aren't even technically REST compliant. There's GraphQL, which is sort of the new kid on the block, which has experienced a lot more popularity and growth in recent years. But we also have other worlds of their own, like gRPC, for example, or the whole event-driven architecture realm, webhooks. And so what we mean by APIs really differs from implementation to implementation and from person to person. So just talking about this and finding common ground, finding standards is a little bit challenging. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on and there's rarely consensus internally. So with all this happening, especially within a large organization, you can kind of reach a hectic state. I'm kind of doing logical reasoning here, and a lot of this is based on conversations I've had with people within organizations, like looking at their API portfolios. So take that with a grain of salt. In that article I mentioned earlier, I talked about how to determine if you have sprawl issues. I was saying if you don't know what APIs you have in your portfolio, you might have sprawl. So, you're not fully documenting them, you're not aware. If you don't know where they are or who owns them, you might have sprawl issues because they might not be maintained if you're not aware of who owns them or where they are. If you don't know how these APIs are functioning, you might have sprawl issues because you won't be able to track their performance over time and monitor how they're being used. And lastly, if you don't even know why your integrations are breaking, you might have sprawl issues. So that's kind of a lot of dark and gloomy stuff, but it gets worse. There's some downsides of API sprawl. I'd say that API sprawl can lead to poor service discovery. Like I said earlier, these shadow endpoints that might be up there for hackers to exploit. It's pretty common out there, just having some sort of endpoint out there on the public web for people to take advantage of, unfortunately. More technical debt, and if things are not cataloged, it could easily lead to less reusability for your tech. Inconsistent standards across an organization in terms of its API style could worsen developer experience because developers just don't really know how they should be designing their APIs or constructing them for others to reuse. So this could inhibit learnability within a platform. It could also affect the security policies if these things aren't standardized. People might just be assuming different authorization controls on a per API basis. If you're not managing an internal API catalog correctly, I think you can have some lifecycle management issues as well. If you're not experiencing, up-to-date docs, you could have unclear versioning timelines, which could affect integrations with your customers or internal consumers, and lead to breaking changes, as I've mentioned here. And lastly, there's that old adage from cybersecurity, right? You can't secure what you don't know. So if we're just in this sprawl state and things aren't really cataloged well and it's confusing, yeah, it's probably going to lead to some lack of awareness and some insecure coding practices. I don't think I have time to go into all of these deeply, but I think a lot of people here at this event are aware there's been a lot of API breaches lately, and they can have detrimental effects. You might be leaking sensitive consumer data, or in the case of this one, Kronos, the fourth one mentioned here, an estimated 25 million of Ethereum was actually stolen in this attack due to unauthorized API keys. So these sort of API breaches can have a pretty bad effect, and I think a lot of that is tied to the sprawl conditions that I've mentioned earlier. So what can we do about it? How do we be like Neo and Trinity here, walking into the unknown to solve all these issues? Well, in that article I mentioned, I summarized a handful of tips and tricks. Number one, just having a documentation first mindset, documenting all APIs and making sure they're reusable and known internally. A good way to do this is spec-driven development. I know design first is already kind of difficult in of itself, and specification first development is kind of a step deeper into that. But if you're using a single source of truth with your specification, then all your libraries, SDKs, documentation will all be tied to that. And so there's less of a unknown or versioning drift associated with that. If you document all your APIs, then keep some sort of active inventory of all of them, right? If you have hundreds or thousands of internal services and they're not even cataloged, how are people going to know about them? How it really hurts API discovery. Even having a spreadsheet internally is probably like a step one, right? And how do you make it more dynamic and searchable and iterable into the future? Monitoring the use of APIs is also important to ensure they don't become zombie endpoints or unknown. Another important aspect is just keeping an internal API design style guide, making sure developers are aware of the expectations and practices around API design. And with that, following security best practices is kind of a no-brainer, using good zero trust approaches and following the rule of least privilege when designing who has access to these services is important. Another thing I've seen lately is just an increase in API governance. Some organizations are introducing, even at the executive level, someone associated with interfaces or API management. Some organizations I've seen, like under the CTO, they're having a sort of API center for enablement or excellence role that's overseeing this and spreading awareness within the organization. I think a lot of the tech first approaches or technology companies, they're trying to automate governance too. So like having push, it's the whole security shift left mindset of how can we like lint our specifications earlier in the process, check for security gaps earlier in the process, and try to automate some of these governance controls and guidelines earlier within the development flow without like getting in the way of how developers operate and their workflow. Another aspect of avoiding API sprawl is, I think, in ensuring a collaborative development environment where you can accept feedback and maybe even formalizing how you collect feedback. I think the Google API, what is it? The Google's feedback improvement proposal, something like that. They're doing a good job with this. So that's one example of this in practice. And then planning for the long term. Like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of organizations didn't really see the future of where this API thing would go, and maybe they didn't plan from the start on what exactly they needed to do to formalize a lot of this. So I think it's better late than never, right, to start thinking about some of that. Protect your API keys. This is probably maybe, okay, it might not be the easiest thing because a lot of people aren't aware of proper coding practices, but still there's a lot of high-risk API related secrets and tokens just publicly out there. Escape found 18,000 of them just surfing the web last year. So protect your API keys from abuse, make sure they're not just in public repositories and such. Lately, it seems like more executives are aware of not only the power of APIs, but the need to govern them and secure them, which I think is great. And I'm glad there's more awareness in general. I wrote an article recently that interviewed a handful of CIOs on their API governance approaches. And people are saying things like, CIOs must support API governance because of its many benefits. Effective API governance allows organizations to quickly adapt to changes. So a lot of these leaders are aware of the problem, and they're, I think, starting to come around to the need to invest into this. I kind of see the API governance leads as like the Xeon mainframe here from Matrix, the people in the back end helping lead these procedures to help organizations deliver a return on income from their API first strategies eventually. The end goal, we want more stable, secure integrations, and investing in this and seeing the long-term aspect, I think, will help future-proof in IT strategy. And it'll also increase developer experience. So these are some of the benefits of API governance that those CIOs mentioned in that article that I mentioned in the previous slide.
Hey Bill, just giving you the time check. We're getting close on time.
We're getting there. Yeah. I'm done. I just wanted to say I'm now collecting input on how do we govern a disparate API portfolio for the next article.
I can't wait for that article.
Awesome.
And definitely people should follow your blog. I know we got another session starting in 3 minutes, but we had some good questions flowing in here.
Cool. I will try my best.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you'll do. This one's an alley-oop for you.
Oh, dang. I wish it was more of an alley-oop because the exact date hasn't been announced yet.
But it's
for the Austin
is it not typically like a spring thing or no?
Yeah, we've done it in March and April. But okay. Matt Pardo, we'll try to let you know.
Yeah, definitely, and try to get there, Matt. It's a really good event.
Yeah, we had a great summit last time. Really good attendance. I think the thing about Nordic events is like we try to curate it, and it's just like it's a summit. It's not the biggest event, but I think it's the intimacy is what people like. You get to talk to other people.
I can vouch for that. It really truly is that. It's a great event. I was sort of stunned by this as well. Well, from 15,000 APIs, what are we talking about? Endpoints or actual like apps?
Okay, I was going to cover this exact point in my presentation. So Wolfram, look at a presentation by Rob Dickinson from Greylog. He covers exactly this question, and they actually query people that they meet on what even constitutes an API, and they get a different response every time. Is it like, how do we count it? Is it by the open API file? Is it by the per method basis, or is it by the business function in general? So I think you're right to point out that, and that is why those statistics are kind of wildly different.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Let's cram this one last one in. This is probably one of the biggest questions that we see all the time. Like, how do you find these things if they're just out there, unknown, undiscovered? Yeah. What are some tips here?
I know some vendors are producing solutions that will like scan your entire tech stack to shed the light on some of these APIs that you might not even know about, because a lot is being developed and not fully documented, which I think is out there. I'm probably not going to mention specific tech vendors, but people are producing these sort of tools.
Yeah, and I'll add my 2 cents. I don't think there's one silver bullet here, AJ. Like, to me, I've talked to Corey about this last night, but like, there's network-based API discovery, so things that watch traffic and look for, hey, there's an API call, there's an API call, and one thing I recommend is actually a lot of WAF vendors are adding that capability to their platforms. So if you use F5 or something like that, they've got capabilities. So, I would talk to your WAF. You may already have something that you don't even know you can utilize. Another approach is like code repo scanning and looking through the source code itself to find it. Of course, you want to be looking at third-party API usage and all these kind of things. So I don't think there's one silver bullet here, AJ, but it's going to take kind of a multi-pronged approach here.
I'm surprised you didn't mention AI and its role in scanning.
Oh, yeah. I should automatically start with that. But listen, Bill, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you being here and everything you do in the community. For everyone else, track 2 has a break right now. And so hop on over to track 1 for Dana Epp, who is one of the absolute gurus of API security. So hopefully I'll see you all over there.
All right. Thanks.